She was forged in the sterile, unforgiving fire of veterinary science, a rising star in a world of chrome and glass, yet she was dismissed for an act of compassion. Dr. Aris Thorne, a name once whispered with reverence in the halls of Omnigen's gleaming research towers, now found herself an exile in a world of peeling paint and the lingering scent of bleach. She had sought to heal, to uphold the oath she swore, but her sanctuary had become a cage of corporate greed. In her hands, she held not stolen goods, but a stolen future, a tiny, shivering puppy, the last survivor of a litter condemned by the very people who created it. For this act of defiance, for choosing life over a bottom line, she was cast out, her legacy erased, her name smeared. They took her career, her home, her reputation. But they didn't know she had also taken their darkest secret. And now, as the relentless Pacific Northwest mist clings to the cheap motel window like a shroud, she understands a chilling certainty. They weren't just firing her, they were coming to erase their mistake permanently. Tell us where you are watching from so we can include you in our prayers. A guardian is coming. The room was a study in beige and despair. The thin carpet, worn down to its synthetic sole, offered no comfort. The art on the wall, a faded print of a forgotten coastline, seemed to mock her with its promise of open space. Eris sat on the edge of a bed with a mattress that dipped in the middle like a weary sigh, her entire world condensed into the small, climate-controlled carrier at her feet. Inside, a tiny ball of black and white fur trembled, not from cold, but from the fever that raged through its small body. She checked the makeshift IV line, a delicate thread of hope taped to a shaved patch on its leg. The fluid in the bag was a cocktail she'd concocted from memory and desperation, a sliver of the prototype cure she'd been developing in secret. The medicine she'd stolen. She hadn't stolen it. She had liberated it. It was her research, her breakthrough, her intellectual property that Omnigen's CEO, Julian Croft, had tried to seize and bury. He called the puppies a failed experiment, a financial write-off. Aris knew the truth. They were a success, a terrifying, world-altering success. The virus they carried was stable, transmissible, and lethally efficient. And this one small, dying puppy was generating the only known antibodies that could stop it. Its body was a living factory for the cure, a legacy of its condemned brothers and sisters. A soft whimper escaped the carrier, and Aris felt her own resolve crack just a little. She was a doctor, a healer, but she was alone, hunted, and running out of time. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, a monotonous drone that scraped at her frayed nerves. Every passing car on the highway outside was a potential threat. Every knock on a neighboring door a harbinger of doom. She was a protector with nothing left to protect her. Miles away, where the fog-drenched pines clawed at the sky, a different kind of protector moved through the forest. Elias Vance was a weapon trying to remember how to be a man. The ice-cold focus that had kept him alive through a dozen deployments in the world's most violent corners was a difficult thing to switch off. The quiet of the woods was loud to him, a symphony of snapping twigs, rustling leaves, and the distant call of a raven. He was on leave, a word that felt foreign and ill-fitting, like a uniform that belonged to someone else. He was supposed to be finding peace, decompressing, letting the fog of war recede. But peace was a ghost he couldn't grasp. His only sanctuary was the silent communication with the animal at his side. Shadow, a Belgian Malinois with eyes the color of burnt amber, moved with a fluid grace that mirrored his own. The dog was not a pet. He was a partner, an extension of Elias's own senses. They had shared the same dust, the same fear, the same grim purpose. Shadow was his anchor to a world that still made sense, a world of loyalty, duty, and clear objectives. Suddenly, Shadow stopped. The dog's body went rigid, a statue of coiled muscle. A low growl, more a vibration than a sound, rumbled in his chest. His head was cocked, ears twitching, focused on something far down the mountain, towards the highway motel that glowed like a festering wound in the twilight. Elias went still, his hand resting gently on Shadow's back. He didn't question the dog's instincts. Ever. He scanned the direction of Shadow's gaze, his operator's mind instantly calculating angles, distances, potential threats. He saw nothing but the trees and the rain. But Shadow saw more. He smelled it. The scent of predators who walked on two legs. The faint, sharp tang of adrenaline and bad intentions carried on the damp air. Elias felt the familiar switch flip in his mind. The fog of leave burned away, replaced by the chilling clarity of the mission. He was a guardian, and his dog had just found someone to protect. He gave a low, single-word command. Up! And together, man and dog melted into the deepening shadows of the forest, moving with a terrifying, shared purpose towards the source of the disturbance. The two men who stepped out of the black sedan were perfectly unremarkable, which was in itself a mark of their profession. They wore simple, functional clothing, their faces scrubbed of any distinguishing features or emotion. They moved with an unnerving synchronicity, their steps silent on the cracked asphalt of the motel parking lot. They were not thugs. They were corporate instruments, scalpels sent to excise a problem. One of them checked a number on his phone against the faded brass numeral on Iris's door, 117. The other produced a small, sophisticated device, holding it against the lock. There was a soft, electronic click, and the tumblers gave way. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. They simply opened the door and stepped inside, bringing the cold night air in with them. Inside, the world exploded. Eris had been half-dozing, her head resting against the cool wall, when the sound of the lock disengaging snapped her awake. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She had a split second to react. As the first man stepped through the doorway, she grabbed the heavy glass water pitcher from the bedside table and threw it with all her might. It shattered against his head, staggering him with a grunt of surprise and pain. She didn't hesitate. She launched herself at the second man, a feral scream tearing from her throat, raking her nails across his face. She was a doctor, not a soldier, but the instinct to protect the fragile life in the carrier overrode everything else. It was a desperate, clumsy, and surprisingly effective assault. But it couldn't last. The second man recovered, grabbing her by the hair and slamming her back against the wall. The air rushed from her lungs, and her vision swam with black spots. The first man, wiping blood from his temple, advanced on the puppy carrier, a syringe filled with a clear, viscous liquid appearing in his hand. Just the asset, he said, his voice a flat monotone. Then, the liability. But the doorway was no longer empty. A dark shape filled the frame, a silhouette against the garish glow of the motel's neon sign. For a heartbeat, everything was frozen. Then the silhouette moved. Elias Vance entered the room not like a man, but like a force of nature. His movements were economical and precise, each one designed for maximum impact with minimum effort. He sidestepped the first cleaner's clumsy attempt at a strike, his hand shooting out to grip the man's wrist, twisting it at an unnatural angle. Bone crunched. The syringe clattered to the floor. Before the man could even scream, Elias's other hand chopped down on the side of his neck, and he collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. The second man, still holding Aris, made a fatal mistake. He let her go, reaching inside his jacket. But before his hand could find the weapon he was looking for, a black and tan blur erupted from the doorway. Shadow hit him square in the chest at a full run, a 75-pound missile of muscle and teeth. The impact threw the man off his feet, his head cracking hard against the flimsy particle board of the dresser. He was out before he hit the ground. The entire engagement had taken less than 5 seconds. The room was suddenly shockingly silent, save for the ragged sound of Aris's breathing and the soft whimpering from the carrier. Elias's gaze swept the room, cataloguing every detail. The 2 incapacitated men, the shattered pitcher, the fallen syringe, the terrified woman pressed against the wall, and the precious cargo she was so desperately trying to protect. He looked at Aris, his eyes calm and assessing, betraying none of the cold fury that had just been unleashed. Shadow padded over to him, nudging his hand, his duty done. Elias gave the dog a brief, reassuring touch. He turned his full attention to her. His voice was low and steady, a strange point of calm in the wreckage. "Who are you?" he asked. Aris stared back at the stranger and his terrifying dog, unable to process what had just happened. She finally found her voice, a shaky whisper. "Who are you?" Elias's expression didn't change. "Someone who doesn't like bullies." He knelt, carefully picking up the syringe, his gaze analytical. He looked from the strange fluid to the puppy carrier, then back to her. He saw the truth of the situation in an instant. This was not a simple robbery. This was a hunt, and she was the prey. He was a weapon without a target, a guardian without a war. Until now. They moved under the cloak of the pre-dawn gloom, leaving the chaos of the motel room behind. Elias drove a nondescript truck, its engine a low rumble that seemed to swallow the silence between them. Aris sat in the passenger seat, the puppy carrier clutched tightly in her lap, its precious occupant finally sleeping peacefully. Shadow sat in the back, a silent, watchful sentinel, his gaze fixed on the road behind them. They drove for over an hour, leaving the highway for winding country roads that climbed higher into the mountains, deeper into the dense evergreen forest that blanketed the landscape. The air grew colder, cleaner, scented with pine and damp earth. Finally, they turned onto a dirt track, nearly invisible from the main road, and pulled up to a small, isolated cabin. It was a simple structure of dark wood and stone, nestled amongst ancient firs, a sanctuary built for solitude. "We'll be safe here," Elias said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a few well-worn armchairs arranged before it, a small kitchen, a table, and 2 doors leading to bedrooms. It was the home of a man who needed little but was prepared for everything. The tension that had been a coiled spring in Aris's chest began to slowly unwind, replaced by a profound exhaustion. Elias moved with a quiet efficiency, starting a fire, putting a kettle on the stove. He didn't hover or press her for information. He gave her space, a silent courtesy she was immensely grateful for. Once the fire was crackling, casting a warm, dancing light across the room, he finally spoke. "They weren't trying to rob you. They were professionals. One had a suppression rig on his sidearm. They were here to clean up a mess. You're the mess. He looked at the carrier. And so is whatever is in there. Aris took a deep breath, the story tumbling out of her in a torrent of fear and righteous anger. She told him about Omnigen, about her work in their bio-research division. She explained the project, codenamed Cerberus. It was supposed to be a revolutionary livestock vaccine. Tailored virus that would grant immunity to a host of diseases. But there was a miscalculation, a mutation. The virus didn't grant immunity. It became an aggressive airborne pathogen, incredibly virulent, and with a 98% mortality rate in test subjects. The puppies, a litter of beagles, were the final disastrous test. Omnigen's CEO, Julian Croft, had ordered the entire project scrubbed, all data erased, all subjects incinerated. He saw a PR nightmare, a corporate catastrophe. But Aris saw something else. In the bloodwork of the last surviving puppy, she'd seen a miracle, the spontaneous generation of powerful, unique antibodies. The puppy wasn't just a carrier of the disease, it was the living blueprint for the cure. The medicine I took, she explained, her voice trembling with passion. It wasn't a cure. It was a stabilizing agent I developed, a way to support the puppy's system while it fought back, to buy it time to produce more antibodies. Croft didn't want a cure. He wanted it all buried. He knows that if this gets out, Omnigen is finished. But I think it's worse than that. I think he sees the virus as a product, a weapon, and the cure as a separate, even more profitable one to sell to the highest bidder after he unleashes the disease. Elias listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He processed the information, sorting it, analyzing it, fitting it into a tactical framework. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. It was a threat on a global scale. He looked at the woman before him, fierce, brilliant, and utterly out of her depth. He looked at the dog resting by the fire, a loyal guardian. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. It was a weight he had missed. His quiet life on leave was over. He had a mission. He was her protector. He and Shadow were the only things standing between a woman, a puppy, and a man who would burn the world to protect his legacy. Julian Croft sat in his penthouse office, a glass cage suspended 50 stories above the sleeping city of Seattle. The view was spectacular, a tapestry of glittering lights against the inky black of Puget Sound. He ignored it. His attention was fixed on the tablet in his hand, his face illuminated by its cold blue light. The report was concise and infuriating. His two-man team was in custody, both with concussions and a collection of broken bones, claiming a random, violent assault by an unknown party. They hadn't seen his face clearly. All they could offer was a vague description: a large man and a dog. Croft's lip curled in a sneer of contempt. Amateurs. He had paid for scalpels, and they had performed like blunt hammers. Dr. Aris Thorne was still in the wind, and more importantly, so was Asset Zero, the puppy, the last living sample of the Cerberus virus and the only source of its cure. He swiped to another screen, bringing up Aris's file. Her photo stared back at him, her expression intelligent and defiant. He had underestimated her moral conviction, her reckless sentimentality. A costly mistake, but not one he would make again. He tapped a secure number on his comms unit. "Activate Protocol Scorch," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "The target is Dr. Aris Thorne. The objective is retrieval of the asset and termination of the liability, and find the third party who interfered. I want him scrubbed from the earth. I'm sending in Tier 1. No more failures." He ended the call and stood, walking to the vast window. He wasn't just protecting his company, he was protecting his vision. The Cerberus virus wasn't a failure. It was the future. A future where he controlled both the disease and the cure. A power greater than any army or government. A legacy of absolute control. Aris Thorne and her mysterious guardian were not just obstacles, they were blasphemers against the new world he intended to build. Back at the cabin, Elias was transforming their sanctuary into a fortress. He worked with a quiet, methodical intensity that was both fascinating and terrifying for Aris to watch. He wasn't just preparing for a fight. He was choreographing a battle on ground of his own choosing. He retrieved gear from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the main room, hard cases containing firearms, ammunition, surveillance equipment, and medical supplies far beyond a standard first aid kit. He moved around the cabin's exterior, a ghost in the grey morning light, placing small wireless motion sensors and cameras at strategic points in the surrounding woods, linking them to a ruggedized tablet. He wasn't building a wall, he was creating a web, an early warning system that would turn the forest from a hiding place for his enemies into a kill box he controlled. Inside, Aris had set up her own makeshift laboratory on the sturdy oak dining table. Using a small centrifuge and other pieces of equipment she'd had the foresight to grab from her home before she fled, she carefully drew a small amount of blood from the puppy, which she had decided to name Hope. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, her scientific mind a stark contrast to Elias's tactical one. She was in a race against time, trying to isolate and replicate the antibodies to synthesize a stable version of the cure before their enemies found them. The cabin became a bubble of tense, purposeful activity. Two worlds colliding, the warrior and the healer, both fighting the same war on different fronts. Later, as the afternoon sun filtered weakly through the tall pines, Aris saw Elias sitting on the porch, cleaning a rifle. Shadow was at his feet, head resting on his operator's knee. Elias was speaking to the dog, his voice a low murmur, too soft for Aris to hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the most open, the most vulnerable she had seen him. He was briefing his partner, sharing the burden of command. He was reaffirming their bond, the unspoken pact between them. He was a guardian speaking to his most loyal soldier, preparing him for the storm that was coming. The storm arrived just after dusk. Elias was monitoring the tablet, his body perfectly still, when a tiny red icon blinked to life at the edge of the perimeter. Then another, and another. "Contact," he said, his voice flat. 6-man team, pro gear, spacing out, standard envelopment pattern. Aris's blood ran cold. She looked out the window into the pitch-black forest and saw nothing. But Elias saw everything on his screen. He was calm, his breathing steady. This was his element. "Stay away from the windows," he instructed her, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The main assault will come from the front to draw our attention. The real threat will be from the flanks. When the shooting starts, get in the cellar. The door is under the rug." He handed her a loaded pistol. "You know how to use this?" She nodded, her hands trembling as she took the cold, heavy object. "Good. Only use it if they get through the door." The first shots were a surprise, not the loud crack of rifles she expected, but soft, pneumatic coughs. Subsonic rounds thudded into the log walls of the cabin. They were trying for a quiet infiltration, a silent kill. Elias moved to the main window, peering through a tiny gap in the heavy curtains. He raised his own suppressed rifle, the advanced optic turning the night outside into a green, ghostly landscape. They're moving into the clearing. Too confident. He keyed a small remote. 100 yards out, a section of the forest floor erupted in a blinding flash and a deafening boom. It wasn't a lethal explosive, but a high-powered flashbang of his own design. The night vision of the attackers would be useless, their ears ringing. Chaos erupted. The professional team, momentarily disoriented, broke their careful formation. It was the opening Elias needed. He fired twice, 2 precise shots. On his tablet, 2 of the red icons vanished. He moved from the window, a blur of motion in the dim light. "They'll switch to thermals now," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He had already prepared for that. Sprinklers he'd rigged in the trees kicked on, dousing the area in cold water, distorting the heat signatures and making it harder to distinguish a man from a tree. Another attacker tried to rush the porch. He never made it. His foot snagged on a nearly invisible tripwire, and a weighted net, something Elias had rigged from a fishing trawler's gear, dropped from the eaves, enveloping him. Before the man could untangle himself, shadow shot out from under the porch, a silent, dark shape. He didn't bark. He didn't make a sound. He simply latched onto the man's arm, his powerful jaws locking down, incapacitating him without a fatal bite. Inside, Aris watched, her heart pounding. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a strange sense of purpose. She wasn't a victim cowering in a corner. She saw Elias preparing to move to a new position, his magazine running low. Without thinking, she grabbed a fresh one from the open case and slapped it into his waiting hand, her movements surprisingly sure. He gave her a brief, appreciative nod, a silent acknowledgement. She was no longer just the person to be protected. She was part of the team. The fight for the sanctuary had truly begun. A desperate battle waged in the darkness by a disgraced doctor, a weary soldier, and a loyal dog against the long, dark shadow of a corporate empire. The assault was over as quickly as it had begun. After another 10 minutes of tense silence, the remaining red icons on Elias's tablet retreated and vanished. They had taken their wounded and fled, leaving 2 of their comrades behind, one tangled in the net, the other lying motionless in the clearing. The immediate threat was gone, but the cabin felt violated, the sense of sanctuary shattered. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and damp earth. Elias moved outside, shadow at his heels, to secure the perimeter and deal with their unwilling guests. Aris, her hands still shaking, forced herself to build up the fire, the flickering flames a small rebellion against the oppressive darkness. When Elias returned, he had a shallow gash on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly. He seemed not to notice it, his focus entirely on a small, sophisticated piece of technology he'd taken from the team leader. "He's fine," he said, gesturing with his head towards the woodshed where he'd secured their prisoner. The other one didn't make it. Eris saw the blood. "You're hurt." "It's a scratch," he dismissed, already trying to plug the device into his tablet. "Let me see," she insisted, her doctor's instincts taking over. She grabbed her medical kit, a real one, not the simple box Elias had, and pushed him into a chair. He submitted with a quiet sigh, his focus still on the comms unit. as she cleaned and stitched the wound with practiced, efficient movements. A strange intimacy filled the space between them. She was used to treating animals whose fear and pain were simple, honest things. The quiet stoicism of this man was something else entirely. She saw old scars crisscrossing his arms and back, a roadmap of a violent life. She wondered about the wounds she couldn't see. "I was a ranger," she said quietly, surprising herself. "Medic. Did one tour before I decided I was better at stitching up patients who couldn't lie about how they got hurt." It was a piece of her past she rarely shared. It explained her ferocity, her refusal to be a victim. Elias looked at her then, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't offer sympathy or ask questions. He just nodded. It was enough. He finally managed to bypass the encryption on the captured comms unit. A schematic appeared on his tablet screen, not of their location, but of a high-rise building in downtown Seattle, the Omnigen Tower. But it was the data stream that made his blood run cold. It wasn't routed through a corporate server. It was being bounced off a secure military satellite, a ghost network used for deniable operations. "This isn't a corporate cleanup anymore," he said, his voice grim. "Croft has government connections, deep ones. This comms unit is military grade. He's not just using hired guns, he's leveraging assets he shouldn't have access to." The open loop of the mystery widened into a chasm. Why was this project so important? What was Croft's real endgame? It was no longer about a dangerous virus and a potential cure. This was about power, the kind of power that could destabilize nations. He looked at the data stream again, a chilling certainty dawning on him. Croft wasn't just planning to sell the virus. He already had a buyer. And the delivery was imminent. They had thought they were fighting to survive, to hide. But now, Elias knew that was a losing strategy. Hiding was no longer an option. They couldn't wait for the next wave of attackers, which would be better armed, better prepared. They had to get out of their fortress. They had to take the fight to the enemy. They had to go on the offensive. "We can't stay here," Elias stated, his voice cutting through the quiet cabin. It was a declaration that the nature of their war had changed. "He'll send more. Next time, he'll level the forest if he has to. Our only move is to get ahead of him, to cut the head off the snake." Aris looked up from her work with the puppy, Hope, who was now showing signs of improvement, his fever down, his breathing less labored. The tiny creature was a living symbol of their defiance. "Go where?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Omnigen Tower," Elias confirmed. "Your lab, your server. You said all your original, uncorrupted research is still there, behind layers of encryption only you can break." Aris nodded slowly. "It is. Everything. The full genetic sequence of the virus, the molecular structure of the antibody, my logs, Croft's illegal directives. It's all there. If I can get to it, I can upload it to every public health server and news agency on the planet. It would expose him completely." It was a plan born of desperation, a high-stakes gamble. A fortress of glass and steel was a far more dangerous battlefield than the forest. But Elias's logic was sound. A defensive war is a war of attrition, and they were outnumbered and outgunned. Their only chance was a swift, surgical strike that would end the conflict before Croft could bring his full power to bear. The mood in the cabin shifted from one of tense survival to one of focused, predatory intent. The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of preparation. Elias laid out his remaining tactical gear on the table. He selected a lighter loadout, designed for speed and stealth over a protracted firefight. He packed suppressed weapons, breaching charges no bigger than a credit card, and advanced electronic countermeasures. Aris, meanwhile, drew a detailed schematic of the Omnigen Tower's upper floors from memory, marking security checkpoints, camera locations, and ventilation shaft access points. Her mind, once consumed with microbiology, was now a tactical map. She identified a critical weakness, a service hatch on the roof, connected to the HVAC system, which would bypass the biometric scanners in the elevator banks. It was a route no one would expect. The night security team is skeletal, she explained, her finger tracing a path on the drawing. They mostly monitor the lower floors. Croft's penthouse and the research labs on the top 3 floors are protected by automated systems. But I designed the emergency override protocols. I can bypass them, but I have to be at a physical terminal in the main security office on the 48th floor. We get to the roof, Elias summarized, absorbing the information. You get us inside. We move to security. You get us control. Then we move to your lab. You get the data. Then we get out. It sounded simple, but they both knew each step was a potential failure point, a potential grave. As they worked, Shadow watched them, his intelligent eyes moving from one to the other. He seemed to understand the shift in their purpose. He was no longer just a sentry. He was about to become an infiltration tool. His silence, his speed, his senses would be invaluable in the sterile corridors of the tower. They packed a small go-bag for Hope, the puppy now their most precious cargo. He was their motivation, the living proof of what they were fighting for. As they prepared to leave their sanctuary, Elias paused at the door, looking back at the cabin that had been their fortress. It had served its purpose. Now, the entire city of Seattle was the battlefield. The hunt was over. The counterattack was about to begin. The Seattle mist was a constant companion, a damp grey breath that clung to the city and gave the air a sharp, clean smell. It shrouded the top of the Omnigen Tower, making the 50-story monolith of black glass and steel seem as if it were ascending into the heavens. Elias guided the truck into a multi-story parking garage 2 blocks away, choosing a spot in a dark corner of the highest level. From here, they had a clear line of sight to their target. The juxtaposition was stark. The opulent, gleaming tower, representing Croft's power, and the gritty, functional gear Elias and Aris were now wearing. They moved with the quiet purpose of a team that had drilled this 100 times. Elias used a grappling launcher to fire a thin, high-tensile line to the roof of an adjacent, lower building. The ascent was swift and silent, Elias climbing with practiced ease, Aris following, her ranger training kicking back in, her fear channeled into focus. Shadow was harnessed to Elias's back, perfectly still and silent. From that rooftop, the final jump was more perilous. Elias launched another line across the alley to the Omnigen Tower itself, securing it to a maintenance ladder just below the roofline. They crossed one by one on a zip line, suspended over a 100-foot drop, the city lights a dizzying blur below. The only sounds were the whir of the pulley and their own controlled breathing. They had breached the outer perimeter. Aris led them to the HVAC service hatch she had marked on her drawings. A few seconds with a bypass chip from Elias, and the heavy steel door hissed open. They descended into the guts of the building, a maze of humming machinery and massive air ducts. The air was cold, smelling of ozone and filtered air. This was Aris's territory now. She guided them through the labyrinthine maintenance corridors with an unerring sense of direction. Shadow padding silently ahead, his ears constantly twitching, sampling the air for any scent of human presence. They reached the security office on the 48th floor. The door was a formidable slab of reinforced steel with a biometric hand scanner. "This is it," Aris whispered, her breath fogging in the cool air. She placed her hand on a panel next to the scanner, typing a long, complex code onto a hidden keypad. Then she looked at Elias. "It'll trigger a silent alarm at the main security hub downstairs if I don't disable it within 60 seconds of entry. You need to be ready." Elias nodded, positioning himself and Shadow on either side of the door, weapons ready. Aris placed her hand on the scanner. It glowed green. The lock clicked open. The moment the door swung inward, they saw him. A single guard, not at his console, but standing as if he were waiting for them. And next to him, stepping out from the shadows, was Julian Croft. He held a tablet in his hand, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. On the screen was a live feed from a camera in the air duct they had just exited. "Did you really think," Croft said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement, "that the person who designed my security protocols wouldn't leave a back door for herself? I've been expecting you, Doctor." Behind him, two more heavily armed guards stepped into view, blocking their only exit. The trap had been sprung. The sterile security office had just become a kill box. The fight exploded in the confined space. Croft's guards were raising their weapons, but Elias was faster. He had anticipated the trap the moment he saw Croft smile. His first two shots were precise, aimed not to kill, but to incapacitate, shattering the shoulders of the two guards blocking the exit. He moved with a terrifying fluid grace, using a desk for cover as return fire stitched across the wall where he'd been standing. While Elias drew their fire, Shadow launched himself not at the guards, but at Croft. The CEO screamed, a pathetic, high-pitched sound, as the dog latched onto his arm, dragging him to the ground. The tablet flew from his hand, skittering across the floor. "The data!" Elias yelled over the gunfire. "Get the data!" Aris didn't hesitate. She dove for the main security console, her fingers flying across the keyboard, ignoring the chaos erupting around her. She initiated the emergency override, locking down the elevators and sending a loop of old footage to the main security hub. She bought them time. Then she sprinted to a secondary terminal, jamming a hard drive into a port and initiating the massive data transfer from her hidden server partition. A progress bar appeared. It was agonizingly slow. The initial guard, the one who had been waiting, was good. He was military. He moved tactically, flanking Elias's position. Elias was pinned down. He saw the man taking aim, a clean shot. Suddenly, Aris spun around from the console. In her hand was a heavy industrial fire extinguisher. She pulled the pin and blasted the guard full in the face with a thick cloud of CO2. He choked, blinded and disoriented, giving Elias the split second he needed. He surged from cover, closing the distance and neutralizing the guard with a series of swift, brutal strikes. Croft, meanwhile, was flailing on the floor, trying to pry Shadow's jaws from his arm. "Call him off," he shrieked, his arrogance replaced by pure terror. Elias ignored him, his focus on the progress bar on Aris's screen. 78%, 85%, 95%. A klaxon began to blare. Aris had been too optimistic. Her bypass had been detected. Heavy armored footsteps echoed from the hallway. Croft's private heavy response team was coming. "Time to go," Elias yelled, grabbing the hard drive the second the transfer completed. He gave a sharp whistle. Shadow released Croft's arm instantly, leaving the CEO whimpering on the floor. Elias looked down at the man who had caused all of this, the man who would have condemned millions. Croft stared back, his face a mask of hatred and pain. "You'll never get away with this," he spat. Elias didn't offer a witty retort or a dramatic monologue. His purpose was complete. He simply said, "It's already done." He then shattered the main server console with the butt of his rifle, ensuring the data couldn't be remotely erased. Grabbing Aris's arm, he pulled her towards the window. The armored team was about to breach the door. There was no way out, but down. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The light touched the calm waters of the lake, making them glitter like a field of scattered diamonds. In the small cabin, now repaired and cleaned, a sense of profound peace had settled. The scars on the walls were a reminder of the battle fought and won, turning the sanctuary from a place of hiding into a monument of their victory. The data Aris had secured and Elias had transmitted was a digital bombshell. It had detonated across the globe, exposing not only Julian Croft and Omnigen's horrific plans, but also the shadowy government figures who had enabled him. The fallout was massive, a firestorm of arrests, investigations, and public outrage. In the ensuing chaos, as federal agents stormed the Omnigen Tower from the ground floor, Elias, Aris, and Shadow had simply vanished, rappelling down the side of the building and melting back into the city they had just saved. They didn't want credit or recognition. Their reward was the quiet morning, the clean mountain air, and the knowledge that the threat was neutralized. Aris sat at the oak table, a microscope at her side. She had done it. She had synthesized a stable, replicable version of the cure. The legacy of the condemned litter was secure, a gift to the world they would never know they had saved. Playing at her feet was Hope, the puppy, now healthy, vibrant, and full of mischievous energy. He was no longer just an asset or a sample. He was a dog, a member of their strange, forged-in-fire family. Elias stood on the porch, looking out at the sunrise. The fog of leave was gone, but so was the ice-cold focus of the operator. In its place was something new, something quieter, a sense of purpose fulfilled. He was a guardian who had found his charge, a protector who had defended his sanctuary. He felt a wet nose nudge his hand and looked down. Shadow sat beside him, leaning against his leg, a silent statement of unwavering loyalty. Elias rested his hand on the dog's head, the bond between them stronger than any steel, more reliable than any weapon. They had been a weapon without a target, lost in a world that no longer had a clear war for them to fight. But they had found one. They had protected the innocent, exposed the corrupt, and upheld a duty that no government had assigned them. Aris came out to join him, a mug of coffee in her hands. She stood beside him, and together they watched the new day being born. They were two broken soldiers who had found a way to heal each other, and in doing so had healed a small piece of the world. They had found their peace, not by running from the fight, but by choosing the right one. Comment Amen below if you believe in the power of loyalty and finding purpose in the most unexpected of places. God blesses you and your families.